It'd be wrong not to mention the multi-billion-dollar effort that has gone into distracting us from all this.
Mike Berners-Lee, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you.
So your latest book is a sort of extensively revised and updated edition of your older book, How Bad Are Bananas? So how does your new book move the conversation forward?
How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything was my first book. It came out in 2010. It's like a tour of carbon footprints of, like it says, everything you can think of. And to my amazement, 10 years on, people were still buying it. And I just felt like it needed a total update. Not just because the numbers had changed, but because the whole context has changed. You know, back then, climate was just a very serious thing for us to be thinking about. Now we're in a flat-out climate emergency, and the whole kind of way that we frame up everything to do with it needs to be different. And when I first wrote that book, I was very reluctant to tell anybody what to do. But of course, as soon as I started giving talks about it, the first question was always, well, what should we do? So the new version has got a whole section on what should we do, not just about climate, but about the whole situation that we're in. I'm in a slightly weird situation because I've also updated There's No Planet B, even a couple of years after it came out, which is a much bigger take on the situation that humans are in, of which climate is one symptom. But we've also got an ecological crisis and all the rest of it. And from a technical and scientific point of view, the good news is we can deal with all of that. But the real question is, why aren't we, and what will it take for us to be able to? So that takes us into questions about how our economics works, how our politics works, how we do life, how honest we are, how much we respect each other at the global level, and all of that. So I've got these kind of two books in parallel, which have a different take on the same thing.
What are some common misconceptions that people have around the biggest sources of carbon emissions? Or are people now caught on to what those things are and we all get it right?
Well, more and more people understand the big deals. So people have always understood that home energy is a deal, and sure enough it is. And to varying extents, people have always understood that cars have got emissions because you can see them coming out of the exhaust pipe. People realize that flying has got a big carbon footprint, but most people don't realize how big a deal it is, especially when you look at high altitude factors and so on. Food, more and more people are realizing that food is a big deal. And one of the good developments has been that, whereas 10 years ago, people were talking about food miles the whole time, which are usually, unless something's been on an airplane, peripheral. Now, the debate is much more centrally focused on the amount of meat and dairy in our diet and how we do that meat and dairy, and that's good, that's what it should be. And also the kind of movement for less stuff, thinking about what we buy and where it comes from and making things last and all that kind of stuff. And it's great to be at this festival and see, a whole stand for secondhand shoes and, all sorts of kind of circular economy type things. So that agenda's moved on a bit.
So moving on to a little bit on There's No Planet B and this kind of question of why are we not doing quite enough? Let me ask you first, where do you stand on this question of where the locus of responsibility for climate change, for the environmental crisis lies? Does it lie with individuals and our individual behaviors, whether we recycle, whether we switch to a vegetarian diet, or are we never really going to be able to solve this if we're just thinking about the individual and not the kind of structural problems of the economy and so on?
Well, we need to think about all these things. Where does the responsibility lie? It's a great question. It lies everywhere. All of us have a responsibility to do what we can to exert our influence in whatever ways we think we can to bring about this, help create the conditions under which humans can bring about the big systemic change that we need to see. So, cutting our carbon footprints is one corner of that. And yes, we should try and be responsible and so on. And by doing so, we send out messages to the people around us, and we also start sort of learning from our personal experience of the micro about what some of the change in the macro might look like. So that personal stuff does matter, in terms of our own direct impact. But the more deeply you think your way into this, it becomes more, much more to do with how we do society, how we do economics, how we do politics, how we treat each other, the kind of respect with which the people of the world do or don't treat each other, and the extent to which we value truth. So I think, there's No Planet B's got a chapter or two about truth and respect in it. And if I was ever going to write another book, I think it would all be about how can we do a better job of making sure that the people in powerful positions are people who are honest and people who care about all the people of the world. Because without that, we can't get anywhere. And I find myself in lots of debates about all sorts of minutiae questions like how should we do meat and dairy, or should we have a new coal mine off the west coast of Cumbria and stuff like that. And the logic of those arguments is so clear cut. We should have them once and then it should be done. And we end up with spending months or years just going round and round and round. And the reason for that is because there are so many people in the system who've got the wrong motives, and we shouldn't have them there, and are being careless with the truth. And the people of the world, including the people of the UK, if we don't want to head for a very nasty place, we need to get much, much hotter at just stopping all of that from happening and getting the right people into positions of power and responsibility.
Let's focus a little bit on this relationship between the kind of individual and the collective or the state level. So what do you think explains the fact that people are reluctant to change their behaviors when it comes to driving a petrol car or eating meat or flying, when they know that those behaviors can be detrimental onto the environment, and yet a lot of us keep doing those things? It's no longer a question of information.
Change is required, and very often we get resistant to change. Especially if we can't imagine what's going to be good about that change. And we don't spend enough time really working up the vision for how a more sustainable future can actually also be a better one to live in for everybody. The quality of life can go up, the quality of our communities can go up. Our lives can feel more meaningful. We'll go around happier because we'll know deep down that we're not trashing the place. I mean, all kinds of things will just get better. But we don't spend enough time imagining that. That's the first thing. It'd be wrong not to mention the multi-billion-dollar effort that has gone into distracting us from all this, pulling the wool over our eyes, misinformation, but not just, there has been a lot of very cynical, deliberate misinformation. But there's also the kind of messages that we receive all the time to just carry on as normal. If anytime you turn on the telly, anytime most of the information streams that we get, and 99% of the advertising is just nudging us to carry on as normal and forget about all that stuff that's difficult to look at. And I think the third thing is that people feel very often a lack of agency. So when you wake up to the climate emergency, the minute you start to think about it properly, you realize that it's a big global systemic problem requiring a big global systemic response. And each one of us is just 1/8 of the whole thing. And it's easy to feel really powerless. And then when you think about it, you think, well, I could cut my carbon footprint. But you start understanding about things like rebound effects, and you realize that actually the direct saving that you think you're making the slack's going to get taken up somewhere else. That's the way the dynamics of it all work. Until we can get the conditions right for a big systemic change. And that leaves a lot of people feeling helpless. But I think the empowering way to ask the question, what can I do, is how can I help to create the conditions under which the global systemic change can become possible? And that actually opens up a much wider agenda. It's like, what can be my influence on politics? What can be my influence on the workplace? Every time I spend money, I'm sending out a message about the kind of future I want to support or not support. I mean, it's just a massively more empowering question to ask. And every time you have a conversation, you're pushing one way or another.
Let me focus a bit on the first thing you mentioned there, which is that we can't quite imagine what future this might lead to. And the reason for that is I think that most of the time we are told what the future will look like if we just continue. And that kind of apocalyptic version of the future doesn't seem to be motivating enough. So are we just focusing on the wrong side instead of focusing on like the positive effects of action, as it were, like imagining a kind of positive future?
Yeah, we should be focusing on both of those things. And we should be focusing on the difference between if we carry on as we are and if we don't carry on as we are. So, I think, I'm a great believer in just saying it like it is accurately, not trying to dress it up for the purposes of, motivating people one way or another. I think we should stick with the facts, right? So the facts are, if we carry on as we are, we don't know with any certainty that blow by blow how things will go. But what we do know with really quite a lot of certainty is that we're in for a very, very nasty time. And it won't just be those poor people living in countries thousands of miles away who always seem to end up having a hard time. The whole of global society is going to be in for an awful lot of trouble. Nobody quite knows the exact mechanism by which that'll happen, but that's clear cut. On the other hand, if we take really strong action really, really quickly now, which means radically different from anything that we've really begun to see so far, it looks likely, but not definite, that we can, broadly speaking, get away with this, by which I mean the number of people who die from ecological problems that we've been inflicting will remain in the millions rather than the billions, right? And for most people, the quality of life on Earth could arguably be better than ever, right? But it really is, it's a huge change. And the stuff that you hear about, in the sort of normal political rhetoric about net zero by 2050, even that is just a sticky plaster on climate change as one specific thing. Actually, we're facing a rack of ecological problems, of which climate is just one of them.
To focus on what you talked about in your third point, the kind of powerlessness and the kind of lack of agency of the individual, you did say that you think structural change at the global level needs to happen. So not only should we be trying to influence our own politicians that we have some form of control over through democratic means, but somehow the rest of the world as well. Like, what is the medium through which we can enact that change?
Well, a lot of it is through our politicians for most of us. And it's about insisting on, to take the Ukraine, for example, which is really interesting because it flushes out just how far we are at the moment from the level of international cooperation and trust that we're going to absolutely need throughout the 8 or 9 billion or however many, we're going to absolutely need that. We need it so urgently. And Ukraine throws into sharp relief how far away we are from that. And, the ways in which we respond in the UK are influential. We send out influential messages about, in all sorts of ways. It's partly about standing up to Russia, okay, sure, but also, for example, the way in which we either do or don't take Ukrainians into this country and, do what we can for them, that sends out a message about how much we care about people who live elsewhere from us. I think the pandemic was another example. What we missed was an opportunity to demonstrate to the world by spreading vaccine early out to developing countries that we respect all the people of the world. And by kind of, playing our cards close to our chest and grabbing as much vaccine as we could, first and foremost, we sent out a message that we're still not in that mindset. That's such a shame. But, all of this stuff we can influence by pushing our politicians, not just by how we vote, but by letting them know in advance of the elections the kinds of things that matter. And, and by screaming more loudly when we encounter politicians who are being careless with the truth or who are putting up with other politicians being careless with the truth.
Well, let's focus on the pandemic. Climate change is in some ways for a lot of people something that happens in the future. COVID was something that happened to them in the present. And as you say, we did see that when it comes to a crisis, people first and foremost take care of their nation state, and then maybe some neighboring countries, and then maybe some other countries that we have some kind of cultural ties with. And it kind of peters out. Is it realistic to think that we are capable at a state level to express this kind of radical altruism towards everyone else in the world?
Yeah, when we wake up, yeah. I mean, to look at good things that came out of the pandemic, I mean, it showed us that we can change. It showed us that actually change is pretty, much more change than we had thought. It's actually pretty easy, The pandemic was an unpleasant experience for most people, but the actual change part of it wasn't particularly difficult. If we were to implement that level of change in a way that was designed to look after people and planet at the same time so that it wasn't a bad experience, I mean, it would just, it would be a lot easier. The difficulty is, we woke up to the pandemic because people could imagine what it would be like to catch COVID or to have a loved one catch COVID and die, so we had a strong emotional reaction to it. As humans, we're much less good at having a powerful emotional reaction when we think about something that might not be happening within the next few weeks, and it's easy to imagine might not affect us, it might only affect other people. And by the way, I think that shows a real paucity of imagination. Anybody who kind of thinks about climate change as something that's not really, really going to hit people in the UK, I think they just haven't properly worked through how fragile global society is. And I think, if there's something healthy about the pandemic, it reminded people of my age, for example, that the sort of stability of civilization that I have always known. In my neck of the woods, society has been a very, very stable thing. You could just ignore those environmental nutters and it's fine. Prove decade after decade it's fine. And the pandemic showed us, we can't take that kind of thing for granted. Actually, we should fight for it.
Well, let me challenge you a little bit on the claim that, well, it was easy to change behaviors during the pandemic, and so we can do it again. I mean, in some ways, change happened because, literally the state banned certain activities. So we stopped flying around the world because, well, we couldn't. It was illegal to do so. Is that going to be what's required for dealing with the climate crisis? Is it going to require kind of mass legislation that bans certain activities?
Well, what happened in the first lockdown, at least, was that the government took, in the end, strong action, and the people were, broadly speaking, behind them, so they could get away with it and they could make things against the law, and there wasn't going to be rioting on the streets, and anyone who stepped out of line was more often than not put back in line, not by the government but by the people around them who thought they should be doing the right thing. And the government had some credibility when it pushed for that change. And I think if we can get to the same situation on our response to the climate and ecological crisis, then our governments aren't our leaders in the way that we might possibly want them to be, or they follow us. So when, for example, Extinction Rebellion and the school kids taking to the streets, pre-pandemic, when that happened, it was pretty clear cut that they opened up the political space for politicians in the UK not to go all the way on everything they should do on climate change, but to take one or two really important good steps in the right direction. And I think it illustrates the point that there's a kind of, there's about three key groups in this. There's the politicians, there's the business community, and there's the public. And each one of those influences the others and gives space to the others and makes it easier for the others to go and take the next step. So those three groups need to move together, ideally.
And what about another disuniformity with the pandemic, which was, we were always told this is a temporary situation, these measures are not forever, these will last for a few months, maybe a year, but they ended up lasting a bit longer than that, but they weren't forever. So what do you think people would be as receptive if we told them, well, you'll never get on a plane again, ever?
We don't need to say that. The pandemic was, for most people, the changes in behavior that we had to do were fundamentally unpleasant. the changes in behavior that we need to do in order to live a lot more sustainably are fundamentally, on balance, not unpleasant. They don't need to be. A lot of us can get away from aspects of our jobs that we actually hate, aspects of society that we hate, spending time in traffic jams, there's all kinds of stuff. A proper built environment will be one that's actually not only a lot more energy efficient, but more pleasant to live in. Actually, what's not to like? The quality of our community engagement will go up. All sorts of things will be improvements in a way that we couldn't have with the pandemic. So whilst there's a lot of change, it's not fundamentally a bitter pill. If you look at what we had to do for the pandemic, we had to swallow a bitter pill so we didn't die. If we're smart about this, we're going to swallow an unusual pill. But actually, once we've had it, we'll think, oh, guys, this is good.
So given that we haven't seen the radical change that we need so far, what do you think needs to change? How do you see the shift happening, both at an individual level, that most people take up habits like eating less meat, traveling less by plane, but also at the collective level, the level of a state? What are we expecting to happen that's actually going to shift gears that hasn't happened so far?
I think it'll happen from everywhere at once. I think it's like a systemic change that will happen. It's not that one thing will precipitate the changes in other things. I think the conditions will become right, and then everything will fall into place, simultaneously. And I think, at the moment there are little bits of dietary change, and there are a few people around who are flying less and so on. But if you look at the amount of meat that's being consumed at the national level, it's not really changing much. So we're not at that point yet. And the question is, are we starting to see, for us, with a system change, you can push and push and push. You feel like you're getting absolutely nowhere. And then you see a couple of cracks in the old system, and it can be a very short space of time, indeed, before the whole thing flips over. So the question is, how close are we to that huge tipping point? When if you look at the kind of, if you look at the sort of material measures of how we're doing, it's spectacularly pathetic. If you were on Mars looking at data on planet Earth to see how we're getting on with climate change, you look at our emissions curve going up and up and up, still rising, as in the amount of emissions every year is still by and large bigger than the year before. You'd notice that humans have had a pandemic. If you looked at that curve, you'd notice that the USSR got dissolved. You'd notice that we had an economic crunch in 2008. Right? But you wouldn't see from that curve that humans have woken up to climate change. Right? Not at all. So materially, we're absolutely miles away. But are we seeing the first cracks that tell us we might only be a very short distance? In a way, I think the pandemic put us back in some respects, because I think with the traction that some of the protesters were getting and the sort of general momentum behind things, I think pre-COVID there was quite a clear pathway, in a way, to getting the change we needed to see, and the pandemic confused all of that. And I think Ukraine is confusing all of that as well, which is dangerous.
So you see the change not happening gradually, but basically there being a kind of moment of reckoning, and then suddenly...
What happens gradually is that the systemic conditions become right for the change, and you start noticing that in sort of, the way that, all sorts of things, the way the BBC talks about it, the kind of things that politicians feel they can say, out loud. I notice it. I run a company that works with businesses. The kind of conversations we're having with those businesses used to be sort of little conversations about how can we cut our carbon footprint. Now they're much more conversations about, we get it, there's an emergency going on. We get it that this affects everything about how what every business thinks, says, and does. And businesses are coming to us asking for a much more holistic assessment of everything they could and should be doing to exert that influence for systemic change. That's a changing conversation. Right now it's only in a few leading businesses and all the rest of it. But, these things can take off suddenly.
You've said climate change isn't a technological problem, it's a problem of values. So do you really think that values are going to change and lead to this kind of shift, or is it going to be more a kind of reaction to self-preservation and a realization that we are under threat, our way of life is under threat, the planet is under threat, and so it won't really be values that guide our change of behavior, but really a very selfish reaction to what's going on?
Well, you can sort of construe everything as selfish if you really put your mind to it. You can be cynical about anything. But I mean, I think it's clear cut. Just from a practical point of view, we are 8 billion of us on this fragile planet together, and we will either deal with the situation together or not at all. It just can't be done without a level of global cooperation. I was in Ukraine. I was in Kyiv at a conference about 8 months ago. Zelensky gave the opening talk, and all the wise people were saying, "Oh, he's a nice man, but a bit of a weak leader." And but the conference was all about climate and security and China and Russia and artificial intelligence. Those were the kind of big themes that came out. It was like a big strategy conference, and half the parliament was there and so on. And the big underlying question that I think was going through the conference was, can humans fundamentally come to a point where they collaborate at a global level in a way we've never seen before? Can we radically, can we make that radical evolution right now? And there were two schools of thought in the room. There were the neoliberals. There was one Harvard professor in particular, seemed to be really enjoying himself, telling everybody that you can't trust anybody in this world. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And there was me making a different case, and one or two others. Rutger Bregman was there, the author of Humankind. But my take on it is that if you look at the historical evidence and the social evidence and the neurological evidence, the real evidence tells us that humans are capable of, through deliberate effort, cultivating a set of values, the values that we need to see us through living well in the Anthropocene. So it's doable. We are capable of that level of cooperation. What we haven't yet managed to do is scale it up to the global level, because we haven't yet got good. We've globalized. We've reached a point at which everything we do in our lives has global implications. But what we haven't yet managed to do is get to the point where we have emotional reactions about those implications that are commensurate with with the kind of impacts that we have. So that's something we need to learn, quickly.
Mike Berners-Lee, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.